Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel, The Lazy Bookworm. I'm Rebecca. I hope you are all doing well. This video, I'm wrapping up what I read in November. I had a really good reading month in November. Most of my books I read in November were non-fiction, but I did read some fiction, particularly actually quite a few contemporary fiction books, which is really good. And so because of that, some of them I might give a little summary for, but most of them I'm just going to tell you what I read, because I'm worried if I give a summary for all the books I read, this video will be like probably about an hour long. So without further ado, here are the books I read in November. I had a couple of DNFs this November, unfortunately, and one of them is Raymond Williams' The Country in the City. I was really looking forward to reading this book. It sounded really interesting. It's about how the country in the city is sort of depicted in literature, but also how literature has influenced our thinking about the country in the city. But I actually maybe I should have continued with it, but I just found the writing a bit dull, and yeah, I just wasn't getting into it. And one of the ways I know that I am not getting into a book is I just don't pick it up. In some cases I actively avoid picking it up. So yeah, I had to DNF this one. Another one is Fernando Pessoa's The Book of the Squires. I don't really know how to describe this book. This is like the thoughts and feelings of one man. He's like this sort of narrator who is just living in seemingly ordinary life in Lisbon. He is the clerk to a bookseller, but yet, you know, through this sort of diary he tells, you know, all about his feelings and his philosophies about art and life and travel and, you know, freedom. And I was listening to this on audiobook, and I was really wanting to get into it, and there were some parts that I really liked, but I just, yeah, it just didn't really grab me. I read a lot of books on and about Greek mythology this month. I guess the first one I read was Stephen Fry's Heroes, and I also read this by Roger Lancelin Green, Tales of the Greek Heroes. I did a whole video on this. I think, as I said, I think this one's slightly better than Stephen Fry's Heroes, but I did find Stephen Fry's Heroes good though. I also read the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. I finally got to read The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I must be probably one of the last people on BookTube to have read this book. I was really hoping to love this book, but I don't. I really like this book, and I'm really glad I read it, but I think I just heard too much about it, you know, with all the hype surrounding it, that I was maybe expecting a bit too much. I'm not sure, but I did like it. Definitely glad I read it, and I am going to read her other Greek retelling, Circe, hopefully next year. I read quite a lot of books on the Spanish Civil War, and the first one I read was No Pasaran, Writings from the Spanish Civil War by Pete Arson. No Pasaran was a slogan that was used during the Spanish Civil War by the sort of Republican or sort of left-wing side. That meant, like, you shall not pass. Another one is I read was A Rose for Winter by Laurie Lee. This is my first Laurie Lee book, and I really liked it. The third one is The Spanish Civil War by Hugh Thomas. I nearly DNF'd. This one is very comprehensive. Perhaps maybe a little too comprehensive for me. Maybe I needed a bit more of a broad read. The last two are again all about writers. The first one is I Am Spain, The Spanish Civil War and the Foreigners Who Went to Fight Fascism by David Boyd Haycock. and Famous Faces of the Spanish Civil War, Writers and Artists in the Conflict, 1936 to 39 by Steve Hurst. Basically, both of these books are about people from other countries coming to fight for the Republican cause during the Civil War. And I'm hoping to make a video on what I read about Spain in a couple of weeks. So, yeah. And but going back to Laurie Lee, one other book I read by him this month was Cider with Rosie, which is probably his most famous book, and it is all about him growing up in a small village in Gloucestershire. A couple of other books I read was Literary Places by Sarah Baxter. This is more like a coffee table book, and it's just about sort of, you know, places that have played a prominent role in literature. So I have to say, with this book, what really got to me was the illustrations. The illustrations by, I think, Amy Grimes are amazing. I love them. The other book I read was The Tree Where Man Was Born by Peter Matheson. A couple of fiction books that I read. These ones are actually books I started in October but finished in November. And one is Jane Eyre. Gotta say, by obviously Charlotte Bronte. I love Jane Eyre. I've read Wuthering Heights by Emily, Tenant Wildfire Hall by Anne, and now Jane Eyre. And I have to say, I think Jane Eyre is my favourite out of all three. A very different book I finished reading was Killing Commentori by Haruki Murakami. Another one I read was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Another book that I started in October and I finished in November was The Bear and the Paving Stone by Toshiyuki Hori. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. And it is a group of 3 short stories. A fiction book that I just finished, just before I filmed this video, was Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle. I've never read any Shirley Jackson. Never read any Shirley Jackson at all. So I heard a lot about her on BookTube. She seems to be very popular, so I thought I'll get her book out from the library, and I got out We Have Always Lived in the Castle. I really like this book. I actually read this book in about 2 days, which is not normal. It takes me at least like 3 or 4 days to read a book, but I just zoomed through it. It was very engaging. The last 2 books I read are non-fiction, and the first one is George Saunders' A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, and the subtitle is In Which 4 Russians Give a Masterclass on Writing, Reading and Life. I started this book, I think, in June, and I put it down. I just really wasn't feeling it at the time, but I really wanted to read it by the end of the year, and I thought maybe it would be a good time to read it during Non-Fiction November. I really like this book. It is a book that you can dip in and out of. He has, I think, 7 chapters, and each chapter focuses on a short story by either Turgenev, Tolstoy, Chekhov or Gogol. I enjoyed this book, but I know I will come back later on and read, if not all of it, then bits of it, and the more I read it, the more I will enjoy it. So I'm glad I finished this book. The last book I read is The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness and Healing in a Toxic Culture by Gabor Mate with his son Daniel. This is a heavy book. I am not into psychology books in any way. I was a little bit nervous about reading this, but to be honest, I was actually quite attracted with the title, The Myth of Normal. But Mate writes in a really accessible way. You don't need to have, done a psychology degree to kind of get what he's saying and be able to relate it in your own life. And that's what I really noticed, how easily I was able to relate some of his points, particularly when he was talking about sort of trauma and how the mind and the body are sort of not just connected, but they're sort of one. Like whatever affects the mind affects the body, and vice versa. I was able to really relate to that really, really well. That is what I read in November. My next video, which I'm hoping to put up this Saturday, will be what I'm reading for December. I know it's late because December has already started, but hey, hey, better late than never, I suppose. I'm hoping to read quite a few mysteries in December because I'm taking part in Cloak and Dagger Christmas, so I will tell you more about that. And I've already started reading a few books already, so that will be the next video. And until then, I hope to see you then.